Hello, my name is Andrew Cooperstock. I'm professor of piano at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm pleased to participate in the 2020 Music Teachers National Association virtual conference by way of this video entitled Beethoven at 250, a celebration of his pedagogical legacy. Thank you for watching. This is not a baby picture of Beethoven. This is a picture of a child of the 1960s who, as I'm sure many of you, would grow up idolizing Beethoven. He was so excited to finally be assigned Sonata Opus 49, number 2. The very first piano concerto he learned was Beethoven's C major, and the first concerto he would ever play with his school orchestra was Beethoven's C minor. Today, he still enjoys playing and teaching music of Beethoven as much as ever. Check out his video from this past February on teaching Sonata Opus 2 number 1 for the Francis Clark Center's From the Artist Bench series, and his Beethoven article for the MTNA e-journal. That baby, okay, it's me, is not a Beethoven scholar per se, but he has felt a personal connection with Beethoven over most of his life, as I'm sure most of you have too. Beethoven's music never grows old. There is always something new to discover. Recently, I asked one of my pre-college students why he is so crazy about Beethoven, given that the composer's music is now some 200 years old. His reply was that the emotional qualities of Beethoven's music, the drama, the passion, the beauty, the spirituality, still resonate today. It is these very qualities that undoubtedly attracted us to music in the first place, and that continue to draw us in today. This year, we observe Beethoven's 250th birthday, and we are invited not only to celebrate Beethoven the composer, but also Beethoven the teacher. Well known and respected during his lifetime as a performing musician, though not without contemporaneous critics, Beethoven would, by today, reach iconic status. Which composer is more universally known? Whose music stirs more passion or is more spiritually moving? Who, at least in Western society, hasn't heard of the composer's Fifth Symphony or the ubiquitous Viralese? Beethoven would surely be surprised at the place he has won in popular culture. The subject of prominent films, the inspiration behind a popular 1950s tune by Chuck Berry, and a 1976 disco hit. Who remembers that one? The author of music conducted by Leonard Bernstein at the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the idol of a precocious blonde boy with a red toy piano from a beloved comic strip. He would even become the namesake of a crater on Mercury and an Antarctic peninsula. I'm wondering how many of you, maybe as a pedagogy assignment, have traced your pedagogical lineage. My teacher, Abby Simon, who, by the way, passed away this past December, just shy of his 100th birthday, studied with Joseph Hoffman, who studied with Moritz Moszkowski, who studied with Franz Liszt, who studied with Carl Czerny, who studied with Beethoven. My teacher, Walter Hautzig, studied with Artur Schnabel, whose teacher, Theodor Leschetizky, studied with Czerny, who again takes us back to Beethoven. Here's my entire pedagogical tree, at least from my university teachers back. I would wager that most of us can trace ourselves back to Beethoven, as well as to Clementi, Bach, and Mozart, by the way. I sometimes wonder what instruction our great-great-great-grand teacher might have ultimately passed down through the generations to us and to our own students. Certainly concepts of dynamics, phrasing, touch, fingering, and pedaling. Beethoven's piano, even in the late 1700s, and certainly by the time of this 1817 Broadwood, was of course greatly improved over the first instruments from earlier in the century. But Beethoven regularly pressed manufacturers of his time to continue to push the limits of sound, touch, range, and more, and the technique required to play these new instruments expanded concurrently. As such, we may consider Beethoven to be, along with Clementi, one of the very first teachers of our more modern instrument. What of Beethoven's own musical background? We know that he received early training from his musician father, Johann, an abusive alcoholic who had had hopes of raising another prodigy like Mozart. And he also studied with a few minor musical figures whose names you wouldn't know, and finally with Christian Gottlob Neffe, opera composer and court organist in Bonn, who became Beethoven's mentor. Neffe provided instruction on music theory, composition, and Johann Sebastian Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. The Well-Tempered Clavier, by the way, wouldn't be published until 1801, but Neffe had a handwritten copy of which many were made. Interestingly, Neffe had studied with Johann Hiller, who had studied with Bach's student Gottfried Homilius, so we can trace Beethoven's lineage back to Bach. Aside from these experiences, Beethoven was largely self-taught. Exposed as a boy to Enlightenment ideals and the Sturm und Drang movement, he would become fiercely independent and innovative, and his musical voice uniquely expressive. Beethoven was able to write not only idiomatically, but some would say even symphonically for the piano. His music was often experimental, and we commonly note his evolution over his career from intense classicist to impassioned romantic. In 1786, at age 16, Beethoven traveled to Vienna to play for Mozart, who told friends, "Keep your eyes on him. Someday he will make a noise in the world." In 1792, a year after Mozart's death, Beethoven would move permanently to Vienna, where he studied composition for a time with Haydn, Salieri, and Albrechtsberger. Upon the young man's departure from Bonn, Count Waldstein of Sonata Opus 53 fame wrote to him, "Dear Beethoven, you are going to Vienna in fulfillment of your long frustrated wishes. The genius of Mozart is mourning and weeping over the death of her pupil. She found a refuge but no occupation with the inexhaustible Haydn. Through him, she wishes to form a union with another. With the help of assiduous labor, you shall receive Mozart's spirit from Haydn's hands." Much has been written on Beethoven's life and work. How's that for an understatement? I've uploaded a short bibliography as a handout for this session. Here are a few titles that I've included. Thayer's Life of Beethoven is, of course, the standard biography. You might also check out the Beethoven Companion and the Beethoven Compendium, which are collections of important essays. H.C. Robbins Landon's Beethoven, His Life, Work, and World is a thorough and standard resource. William S. Newman's Beethoven on Beethoven, Playing His Piano Music His Way, and Sandra P. Rosenblum's Performance Practices in Classical Piano Music provide invaluable guidance on interpretation. In 2009, our former University of Colorado graduate, Eliana Murphy, wrote an article on Beethoven's teaching for American Music Teacher that you might like to check out. Some of these sources cite contemporary accounts of those who knew Beethoven personally and heard him perform. Anton Schindler's biography is another important example of this kind. And we are especially fortunate to have Carl Czerny's memoir, Recollections from My Life, the English translation of which was published in the Musical Quarterly in 1956 and still available today. We also have Czerny's book, on the proper performance of all Beethoven's works for the piano. Beethoven began teaching piano in 1782 at the age of 12 and continued until about 1805 when he was 35. The financial support was often necessary, but Beethoven also took a professional and personal interest in his students. He took a romantic interest, although mostly unrequited, in a few as well. Some of Beethoven's better-known students included Carl Czerny, Ferdinand Ries, Archduke Rudolf, Anton Schindler, sisters Josephine and Therese von Brunswick, and Dorothea von Erdmann. The most significant of Beethoven's students was undoubtedly Carl Czerny, 1791 to 1857, an Austrian pianist, composer of popular etudes, which we still teach today, of course, and teacher of the likes of Franz Liszt, Leschetizky, Kullak, and Stephen Heller. Have a look at Czerny's pedagogical tree. Note that he studied with Clementi in addition to Beethoven, and that moving down the tree branches to students of students, we see many well-known names such as Paderewski, Moszkowski, Joseph Levine, von Bülow, and Rachmaninoff, to name a few. In addition to these students, Czerny was also entrusted with teaching Beethoven's beloved nephew, Karl. A letter from Beethoven to Czerny concerning Karl's education is telling of the elder Beethoven's ideas on piano teaching. My dear Czerny, I beg you to be as patient as you can with Karl, even though things may not be going at the moment as you and I would wish. Be as gentle as possible with him, but be firm too, and he will make better progress. With regard to his playing at lessons, when he has learned the proper fingering and can keep a proper tempo and play the notes more or less correctly, only then should you get him to pay attention to interpretation. And once you have got him this far, do not stop him for minor mistakes, but point them out to him at the end of the piece. I have always followed this method in what little teaching I have done, for it forms musicians, which is, after all, one of the principal aims of the art. Can you imagine what it must have been like for Czerny as a boy to meet Beethoven for the first time? Fortunately, we have his memoir, which describes the event, which took place in 1801. Czerny says, I was about 10 when Krumpholz introduced me to Beethoven. Wenzel Krumpholz, 1750 to 1817, was a violinist and mandolinist friend of Beethoven. Czerny continues, with what a mixture of fear and elation I looked forward to the day on which I was to see the admired master. Even today, that moment stands out vividly in my memory. It was a wintry day when my father, Krumpholz, and I walked from Leopoldstadt, where we were still living, into the city to the so-called Tiefengraben, a street, and there climbed the stairs to the dizzy heights of the 5th or 6th floor. A far from clean-looking servant announced our visit to Beethoven and then admitted us. We entered a very slovenly-looking room, pieces of paper, articles of clothing, and a few suitcases scattered all over the place, bare walls, hardly a chair except the rickety one of the Walter piano, the best ones made back then. Beethoven himself was wearing a jacket and trousers made of some dark gray material of furry texture, and he immediately reminded me of the picture of Robinson Crusoe, which I happened to be reading at that time. His jet black hair made him look shaggy, the way it stood off from his head. Since his beard had not been shaved for several days, the lower part of his swarthy face looked even darker. I also noticed immediately, with the power of observation so typical of children, that both his ears were stuffed with cotton, which seemed to have been dipped in a yellow liquid, but at that time he certainly appeared to be not the least bit hard of hearing. I had to play something right away, and since I was too bashful to start with one of his works, I played the great C major concerto by Mozart. Beethoven soon took notice, moved closer to my chair, and played the orchestral melody with his left hand whenever I had purely accompanying passages. His hands were very hairy and his fingers very broad, especially at the tips. When he expressed satisfaction, I felt encouraged enough to play his recently published Pathetique Sonata, and finally the beautiful song, Adelaide, which my father sang with his very respectable tenor voice. When I had finished, Beethoven turned to my father and said, "The boy is talented. I myself want to teach him, and I accept him as my pupil. Let him come several times a week, but most important, get him Emanuel Bach's book on the true art of clavier playing, which he must have by the time he comes to see me again." Czerny continues, "During the first lessons, Beethoven made me work solely on the scales in all keys and showed me many technical fundamentals which were as yet unknown to most pianists. For example, the only proper position of the hands and fingers, and particularly the use of the thumb. Only much later did I recognize fully the usefulness of these rules." He then went on through the various keyboard studies in Bach's book and especially insisted on legato technique, which was one of the unforgettable features of his playing. At that time, all other pianists considered that kind of legato unattainable, since the hammered, detached staccato technique of Mozart's time was still fashionable. A young and enthusiastic proponent of Beethoven who would help maintain Beethoven's popularity through the early 19th century, when tastes were beginning to change, Czerny learned all of Beethoven's works from memory and studied many of them with the master. He also gave the Vienna premiere of the Emperor Concerto. Additionally, for a time, Czerny was entrusted with proofreading all Beethoven's newly published works and making piano arrangements of orchestral pieces. Later, he would make his own edition of Beethoven's piano sonatas and author essays on the proper performance of all Beethoven's works for the piano solo and for the pianoforte with accompaniments for other instruments. Czerny venerated Beethoven's music, saying, "His pianoforte works so far surpass all which were previously written for this instrument that even to the present day they remain unequaled, and the complete collection of them forms a store of imperishable masterpieces for all time." He continues in his essay on proper performance, "The mental conception which performance of these works demands, as well as the vanquishing of their technical difficulties, which are not slight, can only be attained by a thorough study of them. It is by no means sufficient that the player himself feels the beauties of a piece. He must also be able to reproduce them with his fingers and to communicate them to his hearers." Czerny advised playing Beethoven in a distinctive manner, noting his, quote, "unsurpassable legato playing," unquote, his beautiful adagios, his fugues, and his brilliant improvisations. Furthermore, he asserts that Beethoven's playing was remarkable for his enormous power, characteristic expression, and his unheard of virtuosity and passage work. He suggests learning the Beethoven piano sonatas in chronological order so as to follow the development of his genius and learn accurately to recognize the three periods of his works, which we are all familiar with today. Czerny notes three indispensable conditions for seizing the spirit of Beethoven's works. Number one, timing. Number two, observance of all the marks of expression. And number three, thorough mastery of all technical difficulties. In 1823, Czerny brought his 11-year-old student Franz Liszt to play for Beethoven. Beethoven didn't usually take to hearing young prodigies, but as a favor to Czerny, he made an exception in this case. According to Liszt, Beethoven was working at a long, narrow table by the window. He looked gloomily at us for a time, said a few brief words to Czerny, and remained silent when my kind teacher beckoned me to the piano. Beethoven asked me whether I could play a Bach fugue. I chose the C minor fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier, And could you also transpose the fugue at once into another key? Beethoven asked me. Fortunately, I was able to do so. After my closing chord, I glanced up. The great master's darkly glowing gaze lay piercingly upon me. Yet suddenly a gentle smile passed over his gloomy features, and Beethoven came quite close to me, stooped down, put his hand on my head, and stroked my hair several times, and said gently, "Go, you are one of the fortunate ones, for you will give joy and happiness to many other people. There is nothing better or finer." Ferdinand Ries was a pianist and composer who studied with Beethoven between 1801 and 1805 and often served as his assistant. In 1838, he collaborated with Franz Wegeler, a physician friend of Beethoven, on an important collection of reminiscences. Ries wrote, "When Beethoven gave me lessons, I must say that contrary to his nature, he was extraordinarily patient. He sometimes made me repeat a thing 10 times or even more often. In the variations in F major, opus 34, I had to repeat the last adagio variation entirely 17 times. Still, he was not satisfied with the expression in the little cadenza, even though I thought I played it just as well as he did. I received nearly 2 full hours of instruction that day. If I made a mistake somewhere in a passage or struck wrong notes or missed intervals, which he often wanted strongly emphasized, he rarely said anything. However, if I lacked expression and crescendos, etc., or in the character of a piece, he became angry because he maintained the first was accident, while the latter resulted from inadequate knowledge, feeling, or attention. I'm sure many of us would give anything to have a recording of Beethoven's playing. As an alternative, wouldn't it at least be nice if we could read recollections by those who actually heard Beethoven play the piano? Well, fortunately we can. Here are a few adjectives used by various ear witness sources. Ries, of course, heard Beethoven play on many occasions and had this to say: "In general, Beethoven played his compositions very moodily, but he did remain for the most part strictly in tempo. Now and then he would hold the tempo back during a crescendo, creating a crescendo with ritardando, which had a very beautiful and most striking effect." In his biography, Anton Schindler added, "All the pieces which I have heard Beethoven himself play were, with few exceptions, given without any constraint as to the rate of the time. He adopted a tempo rubato in the proper sense of the term, according as subject and situation might demand, without the slightest approach to caricature." Clara Schumann's father, Friedrich Wieck, said that Beethoven played in a flowing, genial manner, for the most part orchestrally, and was still quite adept in the passing over of the right and left hands, weaving in the clearest and most charming melodies. David Duvall, in his The Art of the Piano, notes an additional side of Beethoven as performer. During his so-called middle period, he continued to perform. His playing was often sloppy, but possessed a revolutionary and powerful emotionality never before dreamed of in piano playing. Clementi felt that Beethoven's playing lacked polish, but that it was always full of spirit. And finally, back to Czerny, who said, "No one could equal him in the dexterity of his playing of scales, his double trills, or his leaps, not even Hummel. His deportment while playing was exemplary, quiet, noble, and beautiful. Nor did he indulge in any form of grimace. As his deafness increased, he tended to stoop. His fingers were very strong, not long, and the fingertips were broadly shaped from much playing. He often told me that in his youth he practiced an enormous amount, sometimes until long after midnight." Hear that, students? As to hand position, Czerny says, when he taught, he also insisted on a proper position of the fingers, according to the school of Emanuel Bach, which he used when teaching me. His own span was barely a tenth. He made considerable use of the pedal, far more than is indicated in his published works. Beethoven taught the Brunswick sisters, Theresa and Josephine, from 1799, and in addition to piano instruction, some romance ensued. It is thought that Josephine may have even been Beethoven's immortal beloved. Beethoven dedicated his song An die Hoffnung, which translates to hope, opus 32, to her. Sonata opus 78 was dedicated to Theresa, and together the sisters received the dedication for the four-hand variations on Ich denke dein, I think of you. In her memoir, Theresa describes her first meeting with Beethoven, which took place during an 18-day family trip to Vienna in 1799. During the extraordinary sojourn of 18 days in Vienna, my mother desired that her two daughters, Theresa and Josephine, receive Beethoven's invaluable instruction in music. Like a schoolgirl with Beethoven's sonatas for violin and violoncello and pianoforte under my arms, we entered into his apartment. The immortal, dear Louis van Beethoven was very friendly and as polite as he could be. After a few phrases about this or that, he sat me down at his pianoforte, which was out of tune, and I began at once to sing the violin and the cello parts and played right well. This delighted him so much that he promised to come every day to the hotel. It was May and the last year of the last century. He came regularly, but instead of an hour, frequently stayed from 12 to 4 or 5 o'clock. The most intimate and cordial friendship was established with Beethoven, a friendship which lasted to the end of his life. Beethoven also taught the Brunswick's cousin, Giulietta Guicciardi, another love interest, to whom he dedicated his Moonlight Sonata. Personal intrigue aside, piano instruction did occur, and Theresa confirms Czerny's remark that Beethoven laid great stress on a correct position of the fingers, commenting that he never grew weary of holding down and bending my fingers, which I had been taught to lift high and hold straight. Well, maybe a little romance there too. One of the most talented of Beethoven's students was Dorothea von Ertmann, to whom the Sonata in A major opus 101 was dedicated. Thayer suggests, in fact, that she might have been the greatest interpreter of Beethoven's works of her time. Johann Reichhardt, who heard von Ertmann play in person, noted, "As she performed a great Beethoven sonata, I was surprised as almost never before. I have never seen such power and innermost tenderness combined even in the greatest virtuosi. From the tip of each finger, her soul poured forth, and from her hands, both equally skillful and sure, what power and authority were brought to bear over the whole instrument. Everything that is great and beautiful in art was turned into song with ease and expression." Beethoven was quite fond of von Ertmann, as a young Mendelssohn recounted in a letter. When von Ertmann lost her last child, Beethoven at first did not want to come into the house. At length, he invited her to visit him. And when she came, he set himself down at the pianoforte and said simply, "We will now talk to each other in tones." And for over an hour played without stopping. And as she remarked, "He told me everything and at last brought me comfort." In addition to espousing C.P.E. Bach's essay on the true art of playing keyboard instruments and its emphasis on a relaxed hand, sensitive touch, legato line, proper fingering, and musical expression, and making use of its various exercises in figured bass and the like, Beethoven often assigned his students Clementi sonatas, which he greatly admired. He also recommended studies by Johann Baptist Kramer, 1771 to 1858, and looked upon them as the most fitting preparation for his own works, and that was a big compliment. As an aid to his nephew Carl's piano study with Czerny, Beethoven annotated the first 2 volumes of these Kramer works. The annotations, which appeared in Anton Schindler's copy of the Kramer Etudes, provide one of the most significant firsthand accounts of Beethoven's thoughts on piano teaching. If you're interested in delving into this topic, have a look at Dimitris Karidis's 2006 DMA dissertation for City University of London entitled Beethoven's Annotations to Kramer's 21 Piano Studies, Context and Analysis of Performance. This is available online after a quick Google search, and I've listed it on my handout as well. The dissertation explains, in 1893, British Beethoven scholar John Shedlock discovered Anton Schindler's copy of Kramer's studies in the State Library of Berlin and published it for the first time, translating Beethoven's annotations into English, quoting Schindler at length and summarizing the value of the annotations as he understood them. In one respect, Beethoven's mode of treating the Kramer Etudes becomes clear after reading the comments. He regarded the mere notes in the music as an incomplete revelation of the composer's intentions. They were the letter into which the interpreter had to infuse the spirit. But though in relation to the Kramer Etudes, these declarations are of extreme interest, in their application to Beethoven's pianoforte works, they become of the highest importance. Only those who have true feeling of music and who, in addition, have reflected long and carefully on their art ought fully to apply these Beethoven directions to the great composer's music. Today, these Kramer Etudes, along with Beethoven's comments, is published by Universal Edition, although only in the original German. Fortunately for English speakers, Shedlock's translation appears in this dissertation and elsewhere. Topics proposed by Beethoven's annotations include legato playing, slow practice, voicing, dotted rhythm practice, rhythmic accentuation, fingering, phrasing, and so forth. Let's look at number 1 and note Beethoven's annotation at the top. You can see it here in German, and here is Shedlock's translation. The rhythmical accent is the same on all beats of the bar. In this way, it appears in scale-like progressions. In order to obtain the necessary binding, which means legato, the finger must not be lifted off the first note of each group until the 4th note is to be struck. With pupils, this study must naturally be practiced at first in very slow time, and it's signed Beethoven. Note the 4-note ascending groups throughout this etude, and the finger legato, which Beethoven is describing. So holding through those 16th notes so that we really get a sense of legato, and that was something new at the time, a new idea about technique. Let's look at one more. This is Kramer number 9. Beethoven says, the triplets in the bass constitute a melody-bearing figure. The accent falls throughout on the first note of each triplet, which almost always supports the middle voices. This study must be practiced at first with firm touch, also in slow time. Since the character of the melody demands a certain breadth, it should never be played quickly. In moderate movement, it actually is and remains difficult because the player's attention is always on the stretch. Before we leave Kramer, I'd like to point out the extensive preface in the Universal Edition. One very interesting inclusion is a reprint of some of Beethoven's own exercises taken from his sketchbooks. Let's take a look. On this page, we can see scales in contrary motion, scales in tenths, and gradually widening leaps. So these would have been exercises written in Beethoven's sketchbooks, which are reprinted here in this Universal Edition of the Kramer Etudes. Aside from Kramer, Clementi, and C.P.E. Bach, that we've mentioned already, Beethoven, of course, principally taught his own piano works, solo pieces, chamber music with piano, and concertos. These scores tended to be much more detailed than those of previous composers. Perhaps Beethoven was more controlling, but he was also writing for an instrument capable of more subtlety than previously. Here you see an early cover page for Beethoven Opus 49. And here you see a facsimile of Sonata Opus 110. We know how painstaking Beethoven's compositional process was, and he sought to be as precise as possible in indicating musical intent. These markings included a full range of dynamics, careful pedalings, and idiomatic or expressive fingerings. William S. Newman's Beethoven on Beethoven, playing his piano music his way, includes a valuable chapter on Beethoven's keyboard technique. Newman points out Beethoven's rounded fingers placed close to the keys and his quiet manner. He continues with descriptions of Beethoven's facile passage work, facile finger passage work, wrist staccato, hand crossings, and octave glissandi. According to Newman's helpful discussion of fingerings, Beethoven's were not meant just to facilitate difficult passages, but also at times to produce a more seamless legato, a particular accentuation, or some other musical effect. The thumb is used frequently and often on black keys in order to assist moving the hand smoothly to a new position. Here we see an exercise to facilitate jumps and stretches. This is at the top of this slide. Notice the 2-4 fingering of the octaves. In the middle is a famous passage from the third movement of Beethoven's Opus 2 No. 1 Piano Sonata. That's a tricky passage there with double notes. And here he is trying to indicate some facility, but also a particular accentuation, as I just mentioned. Lastly is a passage from the fourth piano concerto that illustrates facile use of the thumb. Finally, let's move to a short mention of the damper pedal. While Beethoven used senza sordino without mutes or without dampers to indicate use of the damper pedal, as seen in this excerpt from the Moonlight Sonata, he did this prior to 1802, but then he changed to the standard marking PED following his third piano concerto, Opus 37. Here's a bit of the second movement of the C minor piano concerto. Some of Beethoven's long pedal markings through changing harmonies, such as here, or in the first movement of the Moonlight or Tempest sonatas, are striking. So you can see here that he's indicating holding a pedal through 3 measures and through tonic and dominant and other harmonies as well to get a special effect. Beethoven was equally particular about use of the una corda pedal, which appears in later works. Notice the written out indications of una corda and then tutte le corde in the slow movement of his Sonata Opus 110. Students of today remain eager to learn music by Beethoven and to connect with its still resonant and emotional elements. And Beethoven's principles of proper technique, singing tone, beautiful legato, effective fingering, attention to detail, and expressive interpretation are still hallmarks of present-day piano teaching as much as they ever were. Today, we seek to build adequate technique in our students. We still suggest proper and effective fingering. We insist on beautiful tone, seamless legato, and natural phrasing of the long line. We still require fine-tuned attention to the score, insisting on playing all details of rhythm, of dynamics, of tempo, and of articulation correctly. We teach theory fundamentals, helpful analysis, and sight reading. We instill good practice habits and provide performance opportunities for our students. We teach stylistic awareness and musical communication, all just as Beethoven taught our teachers' teachers. All just as Beethoven taught our teachers' teachers. It's been a pleasure speaking with you about Beethoven for a bit today. I appreciate your watching and wish you all well.